In this video, we will see the details about another distinctive feature that is provided by Python, that is lambda functions. These lambda functions allows us to define functions without any name, and the functions which are defined without any name, such functions are known as the anonymous functions. So we can use the lambda keyword to create these kind of anonymous functions, and so they are known as the lambda functions. So if you observe the general form of the lambda functions, so it looks like this. So first it should start with the lambda keyword, then it can have one or more parameters. So lambda functions can have multiple parameters also, followed by a colon, followed by the expression. And usually these lambda functions constitute of a single expression, and it never contains any return statement, but it can return the value that is the result of the expression. And when executed, this lambda function returns a function object. These lambda functions can be used with the map functions to achieve better results. Now let's see the details of how these lambda functions can be used to create the anonymous functions. In the earlier videos, we have seen how to create the standard functions, and always the function is defined with a name. In this video, we'll see how a function can be defined without a name. So here, if you consider this function definition, the name of the function is square, and this function returns the square of the given number which you are passing as a parameter. And this function can be called by using the function name followed by the name of the parameter. So that is how the name of the function is used to call the function that we defined. So now let's see how the lambda function can be created without using the function name. So always the lambda function starts with the lambda keyword followed by the parameter that has to be received. So you can have one or more parameter. In this case, I am considering a single parameter, as I am going to find the square of the given number, and I am going to write a simple expression which is the square of the received parameter n. So to find the square of the parameter, I am using the expression n into n. So you need not to include the return statement. By default, whatever the expression you are including, the expression is evaluated and the result will be returned. Now the lambda function is defined. You can observe the lambda function starts with the lambda keyword followed by the parameter followed by a colon and then the single line of expression. Now the function definition is ready. So when this lambda function is executed, then it returns the function object. We can actually assign this function object to a variable. Say for example, to the variable x, I am going to assign this function object that is returned by the lambda function. The use of assigning the function object returned by the lambda function to a variable is you can use this variable to call the lambda function again and again. Say for example, I would like to call this lambda function by passing a parameter value as 5. So let's call this function. So we can use the variable which is storing the function object to call the lambda function, and as the lambda function is receiving a parameter, I am passing one value to this lambda function. So here if you observe, x is the variable which is holding the lambda function's object. So that is how I am using that variable to call this lambda function, and I am passing a single value, that is 10, as an argument to this lambda function. Now let's execute and see. So if you observe, the lambda function executes and it returns the square of the given number. Actually, this lambda function contains an expression which computes the square of the parameter that is received by this lambda function. That's what is done when this lambda function is called. Now let's define one more lambda function which is actually used to compute the cube of the given number. I am going to assign the function object of this lambda function to a variable y, so that I can use this variable y to call the lambda function in the future. So I can use y of 2. Say for example, in this case I am passing the value 2. So I can call this function by using y of 2. So let's execute this and check. So this function is returning the cube of the parameter you are passing. So that's how lambda functions can be used without creating any name. If you observe, there is no name that is given to your function. And remember one thing, these lambda functions are usually extended to a single line only. You cannot have complex code or lengthy code in your lambda functions. Let's make it a little more complex. Now let's define another lambda function which uses the control structure. So remember, it is not valid to use any other control structure other than the if-else control structure as part of the lambda functions. And remember, it is not valid to use the regular if-else condition with the lambda functions. You need to use the short form of the if-else condition. If you remember, we have discussed how to use the short form of the if-else condition in Python in the earlier videos. You just go back and check out the video to understand more about this short form of the if-else condition. So let's define the lambda function which receives a single parameter n, and the function needs to test whether the variable n is an even number or not. If it is even, then it should return a true value, otherwise it should return a false value. Now let's use a condition, and the condition we are going to use is, so if n mod 2 equal to 0. So in that case only you can say that it is a true value, otherwise it's a false value. When this condition is true, then I would like to return this true value. So that's how I'm placing this true statement just before the if condition. And when this condition is not met, then I would like to return a false value. So that's how I'm placing the false statement after the else keyword. Now the function is defined, and once the function is defined, you can assign this to a variable. I'm assigning this lambda function object to a variable f, so that I can call this lambda function later using this variable f. And now I'm going to call this function by passing an argument 15. Here 15 is an odd number, so it shall return a false value. Now let's see. So if you observe here, it returned a false value. So that's what we wanted the function to do. So this is how lambda functions can be used to achieve simple tasks which can be extended in a single line. So if you observe, in all these cases, the expressions are extended to a single line only. So such expressions can be used with the lambda functions. Now let's call the same function by passing an even number. So for example, 10. So here it is returning a true value. That is how it is possible to create anonymous functions which do not have any name in Python. And as the lambda keyword is used to create such functions, these functions are also known as the lambda functions. When these lambda functions are combined with the map function, it gives a better result. Now let's combine the lambda function with the map function. So map function is a function which takes two arguments, where the first argument must be a function. Here I am going to attach this lambda function definition as the first argument. So now this is the first argument which computes the cube of the given number. Now as a second argument, the map function expects an iterator. Now I am creating a list and I am passing that as a second argument with the map function. So now let's see the magic. So here the map function is actually returning a map object. So when you would like to check the answer, you can convert that to a list, so that you will get a list. So if you observe, for every element, so the lambda function is called and the cube value of every element in this list is returned. So 10 cube, 20 cube, 30 cube, 40 cube, so on and so forth. Now you must have understood how powerful when the lambda functions are combined with the map functions. Now let's create another lambda function which can be used with a map function. So I'm going to use this structure. As all these elements are even numbers, for every element, this lambda function that is defined as part of the map function is called and it is returning a true value for every element. That is how the lambda functions can be used with the map functions, so where you are doing much complex job in a single statement itself. Now I hope you understand how the lambda functions can be used to create the anonymous functions or the functions without any name, and how powerful they are when used with the map functions. Thank you for watching this video.